speaker, international faculty, visiting professor. We have last 1 week we are having the scientific feast. I welcome Dr. Gustavo, Dr. Natalia, who is very active, sportive, encouraging, making us everybody very active and sportive, and interaction with her is very enjoyable. Then I welcome Professor Das. I also thank him for his continuous, hectic, enthusiastic, supportive for all the activities, sir. So I welcome you, sir. I welcome the postgraduates of my department, interns, undergraduate students, who are this talk is for you people. Okay, so sir is going to speak about this topic we have heard. We are learning what is the difference between low altitude and high altitude. Just we are interacting with the faculty. We had a very good interaction, and sir is going to share his experiences, the way of life in high altitude and how it varies at low altitude. Sir, I request you to continue with your talk, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I have profound emotion to give this talk here, and thank you very much, Dr. Waldinger, for accepting me to give this talk in this interesting hospital, and to Professor Kushal Das for bringing us from the other side of the planet to this side. Not only from the other side of the planet, he brings us from the mountains down. And he brings us from summer to winter. But winter is not so bad here. So, this talk is very interesting. And I prepared it specially for you. And it's going to be a trending talk in this subject. Because I have to explain to you that chronic mountain sickness has been considered a disease, as a unique disease at high altitude, okay, by many researchers. And right now it has tremendous importance. Can I ask you if you can turn this off a little bit? There. And so, let me explain to you why. You see, we that live in the Andes, in the mountains in South America, I live at 3,500 meters of altitude. And so we have adapted to this altitude. And we all have a higher hematocrit than you people at sea level. My normal hematocrit is 50%. My normal hemoglobin is 16.8. And I have lived all my life with this level of red blood cells. In other words, when I centrifuge my blood, half of my blood is red blood cells. And that's perfectly normal for us up there. So that's an adaptation characteristic for those residents of high altitude in the Andes. We have higher hematocrits. Now it has been found that in the city of in Lhasa in Tibet, the Tibetans have lower hematocrits than the Andeans. And so the idea has come that, oh, these people are better adapted to high altitude because they have lower hematocrits. Because the idea becomes, don't worry, the idea becomes that only the normal hematocrit is only that of sea level. You see the logic behind that? Whoever else differs from the normal values is completely sick. That's the idea. So they think that we, the Andeans, are not in a normal condition, and that we would be better if our hematocrit was the same at sea level, which is really totally out of focus, because we have to adapt. We all have to adapt, and physiologically, our organisms are provided with the mechanisms of adaptation to high altitude. So, this is why we talk about the adaptation. Notice this, that this is the adaptation of disease to hypoxia. Actually, it's the adaptation to chronic hypoxia. This is the institute that we work in at the High Altitude Pulmonary and Pathology Institute in La Paz at 3,500 meters. Actually, this talk was originally made by my father. This is Castillo. So I am actually following him through on his many years of experience, and I have added new data to this talk. So first of all, let me explain to you, when we calculate the oxygen partial pressure, we use the barometric pressure minus the water vapor pressure divided by 100 times the fraction of oxygen. For instance, at sea level, we have a barometric pressure of 760. So the multiplication gives rise to the inspired oxygen tension of 150. That's what you have right now. And what we have at high altitude is 100 in the city of La Paz, okay? And that's, of course, the values, and your saturation, here at sea level is 100, and the saturation is 98% in a pulse oximetry. Hemoglobin is 98% carried, almost a full load of oxygen. But in the city of La Paz, we have 495 millimeters of mercury, which is 2/3 less than at sea level. It's only 1/3 less, and it's 2/3 of the value. The PiO2 reduces to 94, also 2/3. The arterial oxygen content drops down to 60, which is also 2/3. If your PaO2 would drop to 60 right now, one of you will go to intensive care because you are at risk of dying. But we, as soon as you arrive, and Professor Cusaldas and Professor Biradar, your Vice Chancellor, came to our chronic hypoxia symposium last February. And they arrived to La Paz, and then they had a saturation, a normal saturation of 91. They did well, they did really well. And if I took blood gases, I would have shown them that they are at 60. So obviously, you see, all these pressures are 2/3, but saturation is 9/10. Why is that? Because there's the marvelous molecule of hemoglobin. It captures oxygen. But at high altitude, we are only 90% saturated. So 10% does not get saturated with oxygen because there's not enough pressure. So there are many mechanisms of adaptation to high altitude. The hypoxia-induced gene expression. There's these transcription factors, and you know HIF, they won the Nobel Prize of these things. And there are several others here. And the relevant target genes, erythropoietin, vascular endothelial growth factor, tyrosine hydroxylase, endothelin, genes involved in glucose metabolism, nitrogen, and so on. And it keeps growing because there are many pathways, biochemical pathways being found, because it's a complex system, but it's a very efficient system. So we have two pumps in our organism. This is something my father described. It's called the pneumodynamic pump. It's an air pump for breathing. It's our lungs. It moves air in and out. It moves gas. And the other pump is the hemodynamic pump, which is the heart. It moves a fluid. It's blood. And so it's two different pumps. The mechanism of functioning is quite different. The hemodynamic pump, of course, is the heart, and it's a contraction, muscle contraction to pump fluids. But the pneumodynamic pump, it's a vacuum pump with the diaphragms and the intercostal muscles. So they both have similar characteristics. The respiratory rate for breathing and the heart rate for the heart. The tidal volume is the amount of air moving in each breath of air. As you know, and the stroke volume is the pump, each pump. When you multiply both, you get cardiac output. When you multiply both, you get ventilation. So we call this respiration and circulation. These two pumps are the ones that work most when you go to high altitude acutely. When you land in La Paz, when Professor Cusaldaz arrived at the airport with Professor Piradar, they were both breathing more. When they walked, they felt the air, shortness of air. But they breathe more and their hearts pump a little faster. So what happens if Professor Cusaldaz remains, because his hemoglobin, I believe, was around 12, right? And so you see my hemoglobin is 16.8, so he had to increase his hemoglobin, but it takes time to increase. So what happens is when these two pumps are working, this is the initial stage of adaptation. If he stays with us for a longer time, then the red blood cells increase, and we have the wonderful hemoglobin molecule that takes over the work. So these two pumps relax. They don't work as much. And then the system becomes efficient, and I'll talk to you about that. So my hematocrit, my normal hematocrit was around 50. Here's the level. I'm sorry, 50. And when I went to the city of Copenhagen to work as a visiting professor, after 3 months, I went to La Paz, and as soon as I arrived, my father said, let's run and see your tests. It was a long flight, very long, almost 2 days flying, but he said, right away, let's do the test. I checked my hematocrit, it had dropped to 36. 36, very low. You know, and I keep saying this, but my mother said, oh, you must be starving to death, anemia, you are very sick. No, I'm okay. So every day I measured my hematocrit values with a good hydration. And you see over the days, here are the days, and this is the hematocrit, it started increasing. And so we have a point of intermediate adaptation. This is acute adaptation, intermediate adaptation, and full adaptation. So here we can have acute mountain sickness, HAPE and haze, and you know, high altitude pulmonary edema and high altitude cerebral edema. But that's just the first couple, 2 or 3 days. You can have it because of the sudden change. And there's an subacute mountain sickness, which can be an intermediate adaptation, and then we have full adaptation, but where you could have chronic mountain sickness. I'll talk to you about that. This is an example of high altitude pulmonary edema. Look at that. Look how severe fluid in the alveoli in the lungs. We call it like cottons. I've seen cotton fields here in this area. It's like cotton in your lungs, but that's water. Another example is right there. Look how sometimes it's only on one side and it's not on the other side. Look at this one. Unfortunately, too much light here, so we can't see it very well. And what's the evolution of HAPE? Here you see how the chests are. Of course, their saturation goes down very low. We can measure 50% saturation. When we measure their blood gases, they can be 35, 40 millimeters of mercury. Very severe descent of the oxygen because the pneumodynamic pump is filled with fluid. So it's not putting enough air, oxygen molecules. So what happens with this patient? You see, that's the interesting thing about high altitude pulmonary edema. You treat them, you give them oxygen, and you treat the underlying condition. It can be several other things, but in 24 hours, you take a new X-ray, like a miracle, like magic, clears up, especially in young people. Another example, you see this is the February at 5 p.m. Look at that severe edema in the right lung. Next day, 27th February at 10:30 a.m., it's almost half cleared. A few more hours, because this was not even 24 hours, it clears up. So I wanted to show you that as a background of what happens with acute disease and going to the mountain. We described this, I actually discovered this when I saw these patients. This was a man who had one of those chest x-rays, and when I asked them, please take out your tongue, I saw that his tongue had these funny spots, like a geographic tongue. And that was very interesting. Another case, same thing, you see? Another case, this little girl, she had also, there were spots. This other one, you see the spots. And it's like the same thing that you see in the lung, sometimes just on one side. You see this one has only one on one side, mostly. And then when they recover, of course, very clear tongue. So this is a very interesting sign. It's called the Habe tongue that we have described many years back. And Professor Kusaldas, I gave him a little book that we wrote many years back, 1980 something, and there it's first described. So it's useful. So now we go to the second part of full adaptation, because this is how it went up from 36, and it took 40 days to achieve my full normal adaptation. In the meantime, when I went to our building, when I first arrived, after I go back now from this stay here in India, I have lost my red blood cells, and so now when I go back, I will be just like Professor Kusaldas, short of breath the first days. And when I want to go to 2 floors, climb up, short of breath, okay? And this is the intermediate adaptation. But once after 40 days, my red blood cells achieve the high level, I can run up the stairs quite well in the 8 floors, okay? So now we talk about chronic mountain sickness. This was the background to show you what happens with chronic mountain sickness. This was previously known as increased polycythemia, erythrocytosis, erythemia, excessive erythrocytosis. This is the term commonly used now by most sea-level scientists that go up for 1 week or 2 weeks to study chronic mountain sickness and come down. We work 50 years up there, and we see these patients all the time. So our experience is very extensive. So my father called it polyerythrocythemia. In other words, because if you use polycythemia, you are talking about all red cells, white cells, and platelets and blood, which is erythrocytosis beta, polycythemia beta. This is not what it is. This is just an increase of the red cells because it's the oxygen transport cells of blood that decrease to compensate. So my father said, acute mountain sickness exists, like high altitude cerebral edema. Those are diseases very specified, high altitude pulmonary edema. But chronic mountain sickness is not a defined entity. Several diseases are the same as those at sea level, but in a hypoxic environment. This is important, in a hypoxic environment. Their common sign is low oxygen tension in blood. That's my father when he was younger, and this is the term he created, polyerythrocythemia, which means many red blood cells. So in one city like La Paz, there are big differences in degree of polyerythrocythemia between residents at 3,100 and 4,100 meters. You see, this is the city of La Paz, and the airport in another city is located on top here at 4,100 meters. So what we did is we take the values of a hematocrit greater than 58%, which would be 19.3 hemoglobin. If someone has higher than 19.3 hemoglobin, we are talking about a polyerythrocythemia. So we went to a hospital and we checked 1,042 records in the city of La Paz at 3,510 meters of all the cases that had this higher hematocrit or hemoglobin. And we found that 28% of the hospital records had higher hematocrit. Of course, some of these were due to dehydration cases. You know, when you dehydrate, you lose the fluids in the blood, and so your hematocrit tends to increase, but it goes away. So 28% of the males had a higher hematocrit than this, and 11% of the females. Then we went to the city of El Alto at 4,100 and studied the records in this city, 1,070 records. And if we use the same hematocrit as the reference value, half of the hospital records had higher than this, and 26%. So you see, you cannot use the same values for different altitudes. That's the important message, because the higher you go, the higher your hematocrit will go. So how is this patient, how do they look? This is a patient, you see, they live normal lives, but they have high number of red blood cells. They have a cyanotic appearance, bluish lips, or a casual laboratory test gave a high hematocrit or hemoglobin level. You know, they went for something else that they find, oh my God, your hematocrit is 70%. And so they become very, very worried. They phlebotomized them or were treated with a phenylhydrazine, a toxic drug. Somebody decided that they should destroy red cells in these patients, and they used this toxic drug, but that's another issue. And they died from the drug instead of from the health problem. The physician in charge, of course, becomes alarmed. His PaO2 is around 45 millimeters of mercury typically. So he walks around with 45 millimeters. Why? Because he has different lung diseases, thromboembolism from coagulation from the legs that reduce the respiratory area, and so they have to adapt to this health condition. But there's many other diseases that are involved. Most patients with CMS are carrying out their lives normally. They have no symptoms. They are mostly concerned about their cyanotic looks. Look, this other man. Or somebody told them that they have CMS and scared them. They occasionally feel temporarily dismayed. Sometimes they would say, oh, I'm short of breath, I'm not feeling very well. Well, this is what was described by my father as the triple hypoxia syndrome. This is a fundamental syndrome because, you see, when all of us, if we get on a plane right now, if all of you go on a plane with me, and we arrive in La Paz, you will have the first hypoxia because that's the lower pressure of the environment. So you will all be in the first hypoxia, okay? This is very important. But then, if some of you smoke cigarettes, you know, or has diseases in the veins, varicose veins, and coagulation, then some of your lung function can be reduced by these other factors, or you have a pneumonia. And with the pneumonia, the healing process is not so good, so that way your pulmonary function is reduced. And so what happens? You have the second hypoxia, which we call stable CMS, stable polyerythrocythemia, that reduces the oxygen level, like that case I showed you before, 47. But they adapt to this, and they live well. They do, only they look darker. That's the issue. But they are doing well, and they can even run. They run marathons. They do their exercises. They sleep. Now, sometimes these guys get a cold, like you get a cold. And when you get a cold, do you get headaches? Do you get a running nose, or you get coughing? And so since you are in a high oxygen environment, it doesn't change your oxygen levels. But if you are in the steep part of the hemoglobin, like we are at altitude, their oxygen saturation drops. And this is called the acute hypoxia superimposed, acute respiratory diseases. So then they go to lower levels, and sometimes they come to consultation with 25 millimeters of mercury in their arterial blood. It's unbelievable. And they say, well, I'm not feeling so well, but they are walking around with these oxygen levels. So this is extremely important. When you treat this acute condition, like a cold, you give them oxygen, you give them antibiotics depending on the disease. Then if this third hypoxia is reversed to the second hypoxia, they go back to their stable condition and they do well. This is not what the literature says about chronic. If you read chronic cough and sickness, the C-level physicians think these guys are sick all the time, they have headaches, and they are not doing well. It's not true. Of course, if you go to a patient and say, oh my God, your blood is really bad, are you really bad, are you sick? Yes, I'm sick, you know. So they get the wrong data. And so look at the varicose veins. And look, it's only one side, because it's a focalized varicose inflammation, and that produces coagulation, clots to the lungs. Sometimes they can, of course, sputum maybe with blood, but very rarely, but that's reducing their lung capacity. In other words, their pneumatic pump, pneumodynamic pump is being reduced. So the efficiency of the pneumatic pump reduces. Look at this other case, and this one also has it only on one side. And these clots that form there can go up to the lungs, of course. So where is the trigger of CMS located? So what triggers this increase of red blood cells? The respiratory center, because these patients tend to hypoventilate. In the lungs, because there are diseases there, like I told you. In the carotid bodies, some of them have an increased size of their carotid bodies. In the heart, some have arrhythmias. From anybody, you know, many people can have arrhythmias down at sea level. If they are put at high altitude, then they compensate their arrhythmia by increasing red blood cells. So when you put a pacemaker, their hemoglobin goes down. In the kidneys, sometimes in the kidneys, if you have an artery of the kidneys, stretched artery, then more erythropoietin is produced, and so they increase their red cells. In the gonads, in testicles, for instance, people that may have cancer of the more testosterone production or something like that, they can have higher hematocrits. In the bone marrow, perhaps maybe in some hemoglobin anomalies, but this is very strange. Very rarely do we see that. In aging, some people think that you are living at high altitude, you deteriorate, you increase more red cells. That's not true. If you have disease can progress, less lung capacity, and yes, you will have an increase. In a combination of two or more of these factors, you know, and so the important thing is the common denominator is chronic hypoxia. In other words, all these diseases with chronic hypoxia, you will have a great increase of red blood cells. Now the trigger of CMS is located in different systems and organs according to different authors in a feedback mechanism with the respiratory center. You see, it starts with the respiratory center is involved with all of them. So the most evident signs of CMS is a lowering of your saturation, and as your saturation goes down, more EPO is induced into the bone marrows, more red blood cells increase, which increases the arterial heart, hypertrophy of the right heart, more pumping, and that way you have an increased pulmonary artery pressure, and the CMS is due to different kinds of disease plus chronic hypoxia. Somehow, you have pulmonary hypertension, right heart hypertrophy, and polyerythrocythemia. These three clinical signs are above normal values for each altitude and are reversible when you go down. If you take these people down, they get like a permanent oxygen. They come to hyperoxia. And so their condition improves because they are getting more oxygen. So the lung is not so limited. The sole presence of these three clinical signs in a patient under chronic hypoxia should be known as polyerythrocythemia, regardless of the pathogenesis. So it doesn't matter what's causing it. What we know is that you increase red cells as a mechanism to adapt to these diseases at high altitude. Other signs and symptoms can be present or absent in each particular case. This would permit a clear identification of the disease. Now, we did a study of the hemoglobin. This is a very interesting technique I learned at the University of California in San